Hello, my name's Julian Birkinshaw. I'm a professor at London Business School. I'm sorry I can't be with you today. I'm afraid next week, which is when you're going to see this video, I will be sitting in a canoe paddling through northern Ontario, which will be a very pleasurable experience, but doesn't help you much. So I'm afraid a video is what you're going to have to make do with here. I had a chat with Nell Dumani, who gave me a little bit of a background on the issues your company and your management team are facing. And I want to share with you over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so some thoughts which hopefully will be useful to you in terms of stimulating you to think a little bit creatively about some of the challenges you're facing. Hopefully some of my experience in consulting work with other companies and other industries is stuff that you can use or at least apply in some sort of way. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you might call I call it the failure of management, the challenges that many large companies like yours end up facing in terms of how they work together. Secondly, I'm going to focus in on one aspect of what you can do differently, which is around motivation, the various different principles of motivation and the things that you can do to get different sets of value out of your employees, as well as helping them to choose to stick around. And then finally, I'm going to try to make that a bit more practical to give you some suggestions about specific things that you might do differently. Obviously, I'm not going to give you the answer. There is never an answer and a single answer, but I can certainly give you a kind of a smorgasbord of offerings, things that you might want to take forward in some shape or form. So first up is the challenge, if you like, the set of issues, and this is really me drawing on my experience as a consultant, as a researcher, all codified in my book called Reinventing Management. And it starts with this principle, if you like, premise that there has been a failure of management in many large companies today. You can look back at the global financial crisis and all the banks that got into trouble. You can look at BP's very, very well known, I'm sure very well known within your company as well, problems in the Gulf of Mexico. You can look at the pharmaceutical industry, GSK, and many other companies are getting into all sorts of difficulties. And whenever big companies get into difficulties, I mean, we can always kind of point the finger at the chief executive and say he or she is to blame. Obviously they carry the can, but underlying all of these notable failures at the highest level, you often see a systemic or a structural problem, which is a kind of a widespread failure of the management system. So, you take the BP problems in the Gulf of Mexico that, as I say, you will know very well. When the report on that was done, it was very clear that the report didn't just blame Tony Hayward. It says there was a systemic failure of management. And what they meant by that was that the risk management systems in BP, the whole performance and incentive systems, all of those things were found wanting. Because, of course, it's never one single thing that caused the problem. What we saw in BP was really a fundamental failure to take, the risks of deep sea drilling as seriously as they should. And, of course, BP had a very kind of a high-performance-driven, cost-cutting culture. And, of course, that at some level contributed to them taking their eye off the ball in terms of some of the safety issues. So lots of other examples, I won't go into them. The fact is that big companies, industry after industry, find themselves overly complex. That is to say, putting in place, shall we say, over-engineered processes, all designed with intention to create order and routinization, if you like. But very often they have the unintended side effect that what they create for employees, deep inside the organization, is they create overlapping roles, they create often very inefficient processes. And the net result of all this for the individual employees is kind of disillusionment, frustration, often a lack of engagement, a lack of intention to do more than simply, do their bit of the job. They spend all their time, can we say, fighting the system, and not enough actually thinking about ways of contributing to deliver on the larger goals of the company. And clearly that sort of negative spiral that many companies get into leads to high levels of employee turnover, it leads to unhappy people, it leads to political game playing, all of which clearly are undesirable. So there's never a simple solution to these things, but certainly one of the things that companies like yours can do if you find yourself in that situation is to take a step back and say, look, we need to sort of, rethink a little bit about what we're doing in the first place. What are the basic management principles on which we have built the organisation, and is it possible that we could go back to some of the basic principles which we've known for a long time are important, and actually figure out ways of using those in a more creative and constructive way, so that we can actually then rebuild our organisation, systems and processes in a way that gets the best out of our employees rather than the worst out of them. And in my book I talk a lot about the various ways of making decisions through, shall we say, top-down and bottom-up processes. I talk about the form of processes we use, the extent to which we use bureaucratic methods or rather more self-organised methods. And I also talk a lot about the overall objective processes, objective setting processes in companies. Nell suggested actually what I do in this brief session is to focus on the fourth of the four sets of dimensions of management, which is the one around motivation. And in some ways, motivation is the wrapper around everything else, because if we don't get the basics of motivation right, then clearly we are going to have unhappy employees. The story on motivation is a very old one. I mean, if anyone has ever studied management and business and basic psychology, you'll know from studies done in the 1950s and 1960s that we often draw a basic distinction between two kind of principles of human motivation. On the one side, we have what is often called a theory of extrinsic motivation, which says we pay people, people work because they're being paid, people go to work essentially in order to earn a living, and the more we pay them, the harder they work. And of course, up to a point that works. We all need to put bread on the table. We all, to some degree, are motivated by money. But that's not all. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the principle of, if you like, intrinsic motivation. And this principle starts from the basic assertion that people are fundamentally, intrinsically motivated to do a good job, to do interesting and challenging work well. And to the extent that they are put in an environment where those opportunities exist, they will often kind of go the extra mile. They will be creative, they will be initiative takers, they will collaborate with others, they will do whatever it takes. And we've had this understanding of these two different fundamental principles around, as I say, for 50 or 60 years. It is well understood that if you want a fully high-performance team, what you need to do is to work on these intrinsic motivators. You need to try to find a way of tapping into people's real, deeply seated excitement about work. And yet, even though we've known that for a long time, the fact is that in company after company, in industry after industry, it is the extrinsic mechanisms that end up dominating. And of course that just doesn't make much sense at a sort of an academic level. But what it does make sense of at a sort of practical level is the following way, which is that it is just much easier to build extrinsic motivating systems. It's much easier to design a compensation system built around bonuses and key performance indicators than it is to build a system which is trying to tap into making work interesting and exciting and ultimately enjoyable for everybody. So most companies gravitate towards the extrinsic end of the spectrum, not because it's better, but because it's easier. And so what I would always advise, and what some companies are good at doing, certainly smaller companies are better at this than larger companies, I would always advise to find ways of seeing what we can do to tap into these intrinsic motivators, to try to build a system in which people actually feel motivated and excited to go to work. And of course, I'm a realist as well as an optimist. I know that this is really hard to do, and even the most successful large companies only do it to a limited degree. But it's a fight worth fighting for. It is absolutely worth seeing if we can find ways of getting even parts of the organisation working more according to these intrinsic principles. So that's the second part of my story. If the first bit is we've had a failure of management and we need to rethink how we work, the second part of the story is one of the dimensions of management that we need to rethink is motivation. The third thing I want to talk about for the last 5 minutes or so is some of the slightly more practical ways of turning this concept into practice. And what I'm going to do is I'll just step through a couple of the categories, the different ways in which you can turn the principle of intrinsic motivation into something useful. Obviously, you have to figure out how this works for you, how you can take these ideas and examples and turn them into something that you can use. But hopefully, this will give you some food for thought. So, what are the ways in which you turn the principle of intrinsic motivation into practice? You know, we can make a basic distinction between, I'm going to say, the micro and the macro. Take the micro side first. At a micro level, what do I mean? I mean that every individual employee, from the frontline worker all the way to the very top, the frontline employee is stimulated to varying degrees to do their work well. And the biggest single factor that determines how stimulated they are is their immediate boss. And that is a kind of a truism, because the boss is the person who sets the agenda. The boss is the person who creates the kind of the climate, the microclimate in which we all work. The boss is the person who, makes our life very easy or very tough or very exciting or very stimulating. So when we're trying to get intrinsic motivation through an organization, ultimately what we're trying to do is to get the quality of line management in that organization working at a higher level. We're trying to get line managers to understand and to deliver on those basic principles of making work exciting and engaging for their employees. My definition of management, the one I like most, is, management is about enabling people to do their best work. And there's no kind of secret recipe here. The basics of getting people to do their best work are known very well. You give people a very clear challenge, a very clear sense of what they are meant to be doing, how their work fits into the bigger picture. You give them a lot of space, autonomy in which to work. You give them an opportunity to figure for themselves how to deliver on the assignment you've given them. And then you provide them with support. And support means, sometimes it means